In this next video here, we're going to take a look, continuing to take a look at Book 1 in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And again, we're trying to get to this idea of the best life. And when we left off, we made this distinction between activities and processes. And we said that an activity was something that's done entirely for its own sake, or at least it's done for its own sake, and a process is something that's done for the sake of some product beyond the action itself. In an activity, the act itself is the goal, and the process, the goal is something beyond the act. Now, it's an interesting thing that some people in history have argued that all acts are, in some sense, a process, but it's a curious thing. Could all actions really be a process whose goal is something beyond the action itself? And Aristotle has an interesting little discussion of that in chapter 2 in book 1. Here Aristotle says, suppose then that the things achievable by action have some end that we wish for because of itself, and because of which we wish for other things, and that we do not choose everything because of something else. For if we do, it will go on without limit, so that desire will prove to be empty and futile. Clearly, this end will be the good, that is to say, the best good. What Aristotle says here is that there is a highest good that we ultimately seek in action. And it's a curious thing. Despite the fact that there's many activities, many different things that we do for their own sake, Aristotle is still going to say that our ends, right, are hierarchical. Right? In other words, there's a kind of ordering to them, and there is an ultimate highest type of end that we can seek in all of our actions. We might wonder, well, what is the highest end? In other words, what is the highest good, the highest thing that we seek in all of our actions? Aristotle says that it does exist, that in everything that we do, there is a highest aim for all of our actions. And if you just think about it, why do you do what you do? You know, for instance, why are you listening to this video right now? Well, you're listening to this video right now in order to perhaps learn some material. And why are you trying to learn the material? Maybe it's because you know you will be tested on it. And why are you trying to learn what's going to be on a test? Well, because you want to do well on that test. Why do you want to do well on that test? Because you want to do well in the class. And why do you want to do well in the class? Because doing well in the class will get you a good grade in the class. And why do you want a good grade in the class? A good grade in the class is good for getting your degree. And why do you want your degree? Because you want to get a job. And why do you want to get a job? Because maybe because you want to make money from that job. And why do you want to make money? Because money will help you buy things that you want. And why do you want to have things that you want? Because it's just because it seems to make you happy. Right? Or maybe you want the job that you want to have because you think you love doing that kind of work. Here's the argument, that in the end, there is a highest end, there is a highest good. And this highest good is happiness. We saw something like this a little bit in Plato as well, too. That Aristotle is arguing that happiness is our highest goal. Now, in Greek, this is called eudaimonia. And it's not happiness in the sense like we have it in terms of you woke up and you feel happy in the morning, and the kind of happiness that a child might report. But it's happiness in a higher sense. It's happiness in the sense that every action that you do, in some sense, is ordered towards that happiness. Right? It is a full, meaningful life. Right? It's a choice-worthy life, right? It's doing things that are most worthy of being done, and we'll see some interesting arguments in connecting this whole idea of happiness, a sort of full, meaningful life, a choice-worthy life. It's almost a kind of flourishing in life. We'll see some connections with this to the whole idea of the kalon that we mentioned earlier in our class. It would be a beautiful kind of life. So here's these things then. We can identify happiness, and all of us here, perhaps watching this video or just thinking about our lives. I mean, who doesn't want to be happy? Aristotle argues that, in fact, everyone wants to be happy. Everything that they do in some sense is really ordered towards that happiness that you could describe, right? And here's some of this idea that if happiness is the highest good, in some sense, you could describe every act that we do as towards happiness. It's interesting. I mean, some acts that are inherently processes, remember when we talked about those processes, some acts that are inherently processes, right, are very clearly ordered towards achieving some kind of goal, right? And conceivably that goal is going to ultimately be happiness. But interesting thing, even activities themselves, which seem to be done for their own sake, can be understood as somehow being related to happiness, not because those activities seek happiness as something separate from themselves, but in fact, a true activity as something that's truly done for its own sake. These things can be part of happiness. Now, there's some interesting arguments amongst Aristotle scholars about this kind of thing, but I think it's easy to see that even activities themselves, which we seek, which we recognize as good for their own sake, that we do for their own sake, are connected to happiness, at least as being something that's ultimately part of that happiness, right? And so that's an interesting problem because that gets presented here because, okay, we can agree that we seek happiness, but are we happy? I mean, are people ultimately happy? Are people fulfilling this goal? And so here's some interesting problems, that not everyone is in fact happy. Not everyone even knows what it means to be happy. Of course, we can with our good old buddy Socrates, we can ask this question: what is happiness? Right? We know that we want to be happy, but what is the happiness that we seek? And we seem to see that people sometimes don't seem to grasp this fully. They don't understand it, and they look for happiness in perhaps ineffective ways, right? And so let's take a look at an interesting discussion here in chapter 4 of book 1. Here Aristotle says, looking at this idea of the highest good, he says, "Let us then begin again, since every sort of knowledge and decision pursues some good. What is the good that we say political science seeks?" Now, political science is actually somewhat connected to ethics here. But we continue. "What, in other words, is the highest of all the goods achievable in action? As far as the name goes, most people virtually agree, for both the many and the cultivated call it happiness, and they suppose that living well and doing well are the same as being happy." So people agree that what we ultimately seek, we seem to agree that it's happiness, and we identify as a kind of living well and doing well. But here's this interesting thing. They disagree about what happiness is, and many do not give the same answer as the wise, right? And so interesting, if we just take a step back, Aristotle now we're going to see this dialectical approach where Aristotle looks very carefully at the appearances of happiness, both in terms of our own experience, but in terms of the opinions of others. And we have to take very seriously the opinions of the many, of most people, but also the wise. And so here we get some distinctions. Let's just keep reading. It says, "For the many think it is something obvious and evident, for instance, pleasure, wealth, or honor. Some take it to be one thing, others another." And here's something I think is interesting. He says, "Indeed, the same person often changes his mind. For when he has fallen ill, he thinks happiness is health. And when he has fallen into poverty, he thinks it is wealth. And when they are conscious of their own ignorance, they admire anyone who speaks of something grand and above their heads. Among the wise, however, some used to think that besides the many goods, there is some other good that exists in its own right and causes all the other goods to be goods." Of course, that's Plato. But here's this thing. Here's a problem with us trying to seek happiness. We have many people who have different visions of what kinds of ultimate life, what kinds of activities will actually make up the happy life. And we tend to even disagree with ourselves.